Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. In today's video, we're going to talk about stacking copper. I'll show you some of the copper bullion that I've got in my copper stack, and I'll share with you a few ways that you can actually stack some copper bullion below the spot price of the metal. And we'll also take a look at some of the worst copper bullion that you could be investing in. Finally, I'm going to share with you what is, in my mind, the absolute best physical copper bullion investment of 2021. And it's pretty amazing because you don't normally find too many risk-free investments, but this one is about as close as you can get. So stick around, we've got a lot to cover. Let's get to it. Alright guys, so why would we want to stack up copper at all? Well, it has a lot in common with silver. It's not a bad inflation hedge, being a commodity. It's a metal, so it's an extremely useful commodity. I would say copper is probably one of the most important industrial metals. It's used in everything from power generation facilities, pipes, so it's very important for infrastructure, power distribution systems, power lines, all of that stuff. And now, as we begin to see the advent of electric vehicles, they require a lot more copper than a traditional combustion-powered vehicle. So I just think there's going to be a lot of demand for copper in the coming decades. If we try to move into more of a green energy infrastructure, we're going to need a lot of this stuff. Things like wind generators, even solar, I believe, consumes some copper. Solar panels typically are made with silver these days, but you actually can make them with copper. They're just not as efficient. So I think overall it's more cost effective to use silver for the time being. But if we were to see something like, say, a silver shortage or a spike in the price of silver, you might see some increased demand in solar if they begin using copper. Maybe the tables turn and it becomes more cost effective to use copper. My point is there's just a lot of uses for copper. It's an extremely useful metal. It even has some history as a monetary metal. Even our pennies up until 1982 contained a significant amount of copper, and we have some other coins today. A lot of our coinage contains copper. So it's not quite the monetary metal that gold and silver are, but it's still a very desirable commodity to hold. Now, some of the downsides are obviously it takes up a lot more room than gold or silver in terms of the amount of value you can store in a given amount of space or the given amount of weight that it requires to store a certain amount of value. Copper is not nearly as dense as the actual precious metals, so that really is one of the main downsides of stacking this stuff. But I'm going to cover a few of my favorite ways of stacking up copper. I've been stacking up copper for almost as long as I've been stacking silver. I think it's just kind of inevitable. Once you become a stacker of one metal, you kind of start to accumulate the other ones as well. At least that's been the case for me. I don't know if that's how it is for you guys. If it is, let me know in the comments below. Also, guys, if you're enjoying this video, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps a lot with the YouTube algorithm. I really appreciate it. But in this video, I'm going to go over some of the forms of copper that I stack, tell you a little bit about those. I'm going to show you a few ways that you can actually get some copper bullion below the spot price of the metal, so that's always good. We're going to cover what I think are probably the worst ways to stack bullion and some things you should really avoid. And finally, at the end of the video, guys, I'm going to share with you what I think is the absolute best way to be investing in copper in 2021. It is almost a risk-free investment, so I know that sounds too good to be true, but there are a few caveats to that, so stick around to the end of the video. It's going to be great. And with that being said, let's get to the first type of copper. Copper scrap metal. So what you're looking at is exactly what it looks like. It's a bunch of copper wire, and we've got some copper pipe over here. I'm not going to say too much about copper scrap, just that if you come across some, it's probably worthwhile hanging on to. I don't know if I'd be out there stripping wires or disassembling appliances to try to get at the copper. You'd have to kind of figure out how much copper you can get in terms of the amount of time and effort you have to put into it, because that's the thing about copper. You really need a lot of it to be of any value. And one thing about copper scrap that you should be aware of is that in an inflationary environment, this stuff does go up in price a lot. So one of the things you have to be aware of is theft. I've mentioned in previous videos that I've got some family over in Venezuela. Well, one of the people in my family is an elderly woman, and she has kind of this large house. She runs it like a boarding house, and she has tenants, and she's got a big air conditioner outside, and it's been stolen several times. So the first time her AC got stolen for the copper, and then she had a new one installed, and she had a big cage installed over the top of it to protect it, and then that got cut through by thieves who stole a boarding house, and she has tenants, and she's got a big air conditioner outside, and it's been stolen several times. So the first time her AC got stolen for the copper, and then she had a new one installed, and she had a big cage installed over the top of it to protect it, and then that got cut through by thieves who stole that unit, and now I think maybe she has one up on the roof or something along those lines, and even that probably isn't too safe. If we do experience any kind of significant inflationary event in the US, you got to start guarding your own copper scrap. But in the meantime, if you come across any copper scrap, hang on to that. But I'm going to tell you, there are better forms of copper bullion out there for you. Okay, so next up we have copper bars and rounds and other generic copper bullion like this. And you're going to notice that in this video I only have one piece of copper like this. I don't have a big collection of copper rounds or bars to show you. Now, there are some cool copper rounds out there, and if you want to buy those just to be a collector, that's one thing. But I want to tell you guys that this is probably the absolute worst bullion investment you can make. This is the worst way to invest in copper. And the reason is because the premiums for these things are just absolutely outrageous. So this is a 2-kilo copper bar. I actually bought this to make a video where I was testing the diamagnetic properties of a large silver bar with a neodymium magnet, and I wanted to have a copper bar to compare it to. So, I had an excuse to buy this, and I think I probably did that video just so I would have an excuse to buy a cool piece of copper bullion like this. I paid $65 for this bar. 2 kilos of copper is about just under $20 worth of copper at the current spot price. So I paid about 3.5 times the actual copper value of this bar for the bar itself. That's okay because, like I said, I like having a big copper bar. I think it's cool. It's a neat piece of bullion. You could use this for like a paperweight or a doorstop or something if you wanted to. But I would not consider this to be a good copper investment. This is not somewhere where you want to be putting a lot of money in order to get exposure to the price of the metal. This is just a neat collectible piece of bullion. If you could find something like this for close to the spot price of copper, I would say go ahead. But everything I've seen is just crazy premiums. If you go down to the 1 ounce round size, it's even worse than these 2-kilo bars. You're paying just astronomical markups for those 1 ounce copper rounds. So I think that those are really something to stay away from for the copper investor. Fine for a copper collector, but don't get suckered into thinking that those are a bullion investment, because they're really not. You're paying an enormous premium over the spot price of the metal contained within bullion products like that. And the next type of copper bullion is one of my personal favorites, and that's pre-1982 pennies. So pennies that were minted in 1981 and earlier are actually 95% copper. The current composition is almost entirely zinc with a thin copper jacket around it. And in 1982, that's when they actually switched the composition. Some of the pennies minted in 1982 are copper and some of them are zinc. So to really determine your 1982 pennies composition, you need to probably weigh it to be 100% sure. But if you just stick to pennies from 1981 and earlier, you can be guaranteed that your pennies are made of copper. There's a few exceptions. There were a few years in the 40s when copper was being used as a war material, so those pennies are made of steel. But those are really easy to pick out, and I don't think you need to worry too much about coming across those. They're not super common. The great thing about pennies is that you can obtain these for 1 cent, and if we go over to coinflation.com, we can actually see that these are worth just over 2.8 cents. So it's a 1 cent coin, and its actual melt value is 280% above 1 cent. So every time you get one of these, you're making a significant return on your money. Now, the downside is that it can be kind of tough to isolate these from the rest of the pennies, the ones that are made of zinc. So you can do some coin roll hunting. I used to enjoy doing that. It's kind of fun. You go get boxes of pennies from the bank like this one, and then you open up the rolls and you sort through all of them. It's time consuming. Pennies are actually kind of dirty too, is what you find out when you start sorting through them. It's very labor intensive. I mean, I don't really think the return is worth it in terms of what you're getting monetarily, but if you enjoy doing it and it's fun, then it's not a bad way to kill some time. Some of the other things you might find while you're coin roll hunting for these are some old wheat pennies, which are pretty cool. You can stack these up. I've got a bunch of these from doing that coin roll hunting. You might even find the occasional Indian head penny. I found a few of those. And then every now and then you'll find a dime tucked into a roll of pennies, which I know that sounds like a small thing, but hey, that's a nice return. You paid 1 cent for a 10-cent coin. Pennies are a nice way to get exposure to copper, but it's a little bit labor intensive. Now, you could go out and you could buy copper pennies from somebody who's already done the work of sorting them, but they're going to charge you a premium for having done that work, and so it really kind of takes the appeal out of these as a copper investment. Right now, you can't melt these down. It's illegal to do so. But in my mind, that's really not much of a problem, because why would you want to melt them down? They're already in a great form to be used as hard money. They're already in the form of legal tender coins, so no need to melt them down. They are valuable in and of themselves. And that rule might change in the future. Who knows? If we saw a big national copper shortage, maybe they would change that law so that we could melt some of these down to get at them for industrial purposes. Who knows what will happen with that going forward. Now, I don't do coin roll hunting with these anymore too frequently, but what I do is anytime I'm handling cash or anytime that I'm paying for things in cash and getting change, I always just take out the copper pennies and set them aside and throw them in a jar. And once that jar fills up, I go ahead and roll them up like this, and I stick them into the bank boxes, and they stack up very nicely. These used to be one of my favorite ways to invest in copper bullion, but I have a new favorite, and that new favorite is modern US nickels. A lot of people probably don't realize that our modern nickel coin is actually composed of 75% copper. It's a uniform alloy of 25% nickel and 75% copper. So if we go over to coinflation.com, we can take a look and see that one modern nickel, which has a 5-cent face value, actually contains over 6 cents worth of metal at today's spot prices. So every time you buy a $100 bank box of nickels, you're actually getting $120 worth of bullion. The reason that I keep saying this is a risk-free investment is that even if the price of copper or nickel or both metals were to go to zero, you would never lose your initial investment, because these nickels themselves have a face value of $100. There's $100 worth of nickels in here. You just take them back to the bank and deposit them back into your account, and you wouldn't lose your money. But I don't think that the likelihood of copper and nickel going down significantly is very high, given the fact that we're building all these electric cars. And nickel, by the way, which makes up 25% of these coins, is an extremely important metal for making electric vehicle batteries. So don't think that the nickel price is going to be dropping anytime soon. Obviously, the advantage to these over pennies is that you don't have to sort through them in order to get at the copper. This is much more scalable. You could presumably invest as much money as you wanted into these nickels. The only downside to this, and it's not like it's an insignificant downside, I understand that, is that you have to warehouse these things, and they're heavy. You got to move them around. So if you wanted to put thousands of dollars into nickel and copper bullion, I think this probably would be the best way to do it, but you would need to find a place to store them. Now, I remember reading maybe about 10 years ago, Kyle Bass, a hedge fund manager, had actually purchased like $1 million worth of nickels or something like that. It was some astronomical number of nickels, and he was paying to warehouse them, and it was a bet on inflation. Now, he might have been a little bit early to the party doing that. I don't know if he maintains that position to this day, because at this point, after a decade, I'm sure the warehouse costs of storing all of those nickels probably does add up over time. But I think that he may actually still reap the benefit if he did maintain that position, because I really think that the price of both of these industrial metals is going to go up significantly over the next decade and beyond that, as billions of people around the world begin to live a more middle-class lifestyle. As the world continues to industrialize and electrify, they're going to need a lot of nickel and a lot of copper to do all of those things. Also, in the inflationary environment that we're in right now, I think that copper and nickel both are going to do well. So I view this as being a pretty much a sure thing. Now, I don't have a huge warehouse to store my nickels, so I don't have too many of these. But, you could always get creative. Maybe you could make some furniture out of these nickel boxes. I don't know. I'm sure there are some stackers out there who are stacking these. I'm not the only person aware of the fact that these are such a advantageous and risk-free investment at the moment. So There may come a day when you can't go to the bank and get $100 worth of nickels. That would not surprise me. So I think now is a good time if you are looking to invest in copper or stack up some physical copper bullion. It's a good time to consider some nickels. Don't waste your money on things like this copper bar when there are much cheaper forms of copper bullion and nickel bullion available to us. I think that this is an opportunity that we shouldn't ignore. So anyway, let me know what you guys think. Are any of you stacking up nickels out there? What do you guys think is the best way to be investing in copper in 2021? I would love to hear what you think. I'd love to hear what kind of copper bullion you guys are holding, or if any of you are holding copper at all. I'm sure there are some silver and gold purists out there who wouldn't bother with these base industrial metals. Thank you guys all very much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to see that video where I test a neodymium magnet on this copper bar, then check it out right here, and I will catch you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Smart Silver Stacker out.